And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tina Brock, your host for Into the Absurd and the producing artistic director here at the Idiopathic Radiculopathy Consortium. Today, I am coming to you from the Guggenheim, and we are going to be talking about the practice of art, the way in which museums as institutions for art, the ways in which we can put education and art together in the community to bridge all kinds of understanding and create new collaborations. And we're going to be doing that with our guest, Dr. William Crowe, who is the director of the Lehigh University Galleries, and he's a professor of practice in the School of Art, Architecture, and Design at Lehigh University. So all that is coming up in the next 50 minutes. I am so very glad that you are with us today on this very special day. Thank you if you're coming in to us on Zoom. If you're here joining us at the Zoom table, thank you so much. And if you are coming to us on Facebook Live, if you head on over to the IRC's website at some point during the week and sign up for our mailing list, you'll be sure and get all of the information on all the guests that are coming up in the weeks to come. This is our way of sharing this time with you while we can't be with you on the stage, and it's our way of looking into the practice, the passions of artists and creators and people that are just doing amazing things in the community during this very existentially challenging time, which hopefully just got a little bit less existentially challenging today for all of us. Though with COVID still out there, we'll be here on Saturdays at 5 p.m. So I want to say a big thank you to Erica Holscher, who is the Associate Artistic Director here at the Idiopathic Radiculopathy Consortium, and to Bob Schmidt, who is our Ways and Means Coordinator. They are flying this plane from the Guggenheim today, and we appreciate them for all of their work. Dr. William Crowe is our guest today, and we're going to talk about, he has such a fascinating, fabulous background in both the practical aspects of art and education. And I just want to get to this conversation right away. So Dr. William Crowe, welcome to Into the Absurd.
Hi, well, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm just delighted. I have to tell you that, today, whether, being exhilarated, art comes to mind when we are at times where things are not, forgetting that we're not out of a pandemic yet. Art can be that great salve for us. And I was at one of your old stomping grounds, about a month and a half ago up at the Met, just in a respite, trying to get away from it all. And it just reminds me of the ways in which art is so very important to our humanity. And obviously, you know that because that's the practice that you have. But I just want to thank you for that, for being a part of that, and for the work that you do to educate others in the community on that. And I wanted to start with your education and understanding and letting the audience know that your degrees in your BA, right, from Wake Forest, and that was in the romance languages and studio art as well? Was it a dual?
Exactly.
And then moving on to the work at Hunter College and your master's in, is it painting?
And painting.
In painting, and then cognitive studies and your PhD at Columbia. Tell me about when you started. Was your goal to be working as a fine artist?
It was, at least for a good while. Honestly, I was kind of a latecomer to art. I grew up in a really small rural town in southwestern Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the Appalachian Trail. It's beautiful countryside. Not a lot there, kind of culturally speaking, but incredible landscape. As I grew up, I loved making things. I made models and sketches, and I completely annoyed my parents. I was always like constructing something out in our yard and, doing all sorts of things like that. But it really was not until high school, really, when I had an extremely dedicated and passionate art teacher where I realized, oh, like this is a whole field. Like one can actually become an artist, and this is, a real area of inquiry. So I pursued that, and when I went to college, I was a double major, as you mentioned, in studio art and Romance languages. Did not grow up going to museums at all. In fact, my very first experience at a museum was kind of terrifying. My parents took me to the Southwest Virginia Museum of Science, which at that time was in an old mansion that looked like the house from the film Psycho. And, it was filled with all kinds of gadgets, and they were creating lightning bolts and electricity. And there was one exhibit where you had to put your hand into kind of an enclosed space that you could not see to be able to feel fossils. And I remember running out of that room screaming.
Mm-hmm.
So I really did not grow up going to museums or really being that immersed in art. It was really something when I got into college, explored it further, and then eventually saw that as a path for myself.
And the path was working practically as an artist. Is that how it started out
It was, I mean,
in school?
I think, well, like a lot of people who end up in museums, my path is not very linear. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
circuitous, but right out of college, I actually taught high school for a couple of years. So I did that. I was a teacher at a school in New Jersey that was part of a Benedictine monastery. So I lived at the monastery for a while, and I made paintings and I taught. And so that was a really fascinating experience. And then, like you said, I ended up moving back into the city. I went to Hunter for my
Mm-hmm.
M.F.A. And really had the ambitions of becoming a visual artist. I had some success showing my work in group shows and some solo shows. Had some artist residencies. Probably the most notable one was I was an artist in residence in the World Trade Center on the 91st floor of Tower One. And so I was there for a year as part of their World Views program, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And fortunately was there from 2000 to 2001 and moved out in the summer of 2001. But yeah, I showed my work, I practiced, and I still make art. But I've also come to realize that you can make art in many different forms, even if you are a museum director. There are other ways of making art as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, the
Mhm.
PhD in cognitive sciences, what was the shift, the addition of that path of
Yeah, yeah. So
inquiry?
I mean, I think one thing that I've always been interested in is how people think. What's going on inside people's heads. How do they really even consider works of art? Like, what do they think about them? How do they form evaluations about them and judgments about them? And so I had done my MFA in painting. I was working in museums. I was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in my role at the Metropolitan, overseeing education, we were also very concerned with measuring things. Like
Mhm.
how do we really know that people are having an impactful experience, or how do we really assess what's happening through these programs that we offer or interactions with works of art. So I kind of, in a very backwards way, stumbled into the field of cognitive science. So, how people think, how they use different thinking skills. I started a program at Columbia where I was a little bit of the odd bird, I have to say. Most of my peers were really interested in scientific reasoning or mathematical reasoning skills, and even my advisor was really most interested in argumentation and some other areas. But I wandered my way into that field, and I'm really glad that I did, and it ended up doing a dissertation on basically on how our unspoken beliefs about knowledge and where knowledge comes from affects the way that we make judgments in the world,
Mm.
not only about works of art, but I ended up doing an empirical comparative study where I did some tests among different age groups, looking at how people make judgments and whether they use criteria or not. And actually, one of the tasks that I had them do was picking a political candidate. And this was 9, 10, 11 years ago now, but had them kind of, explaining their choices about picking political candidates as a comparative study with works of art. And it was fascinating to see like where people converge, where
Mm.
they diverge, and that. Uh,
Wow.
it's a really wonderful field.
Just to jump back a little bit in the work about what you talked about, measuring people's experiences and how they how they come to the work, and I'm talking about in a museum specifically right now. Did you ever look, was there ever any part of the study that did actually go into museums? Or I guess the better question is, how do you measure that as a person working as long as you have an education? How do you know if what you're doing is working?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and there's many sides to that question. You know, there are many people that would say, well, why should we measure it? Like we all get pleasure and enjoyment and excitement out of experiences with art, whether it's theater or music or visual arts. And then other people might say, well, you know, how do we know that we're getting the results that we want, or how do we know when we're actually having an impact on someone? So I was kind of forced into that area, partly because of my interest in how people think, but frankly, partly because the museum world and the nonprofit world was very quickly moving in that direction. In the early to mid 90s, the whole world of philanthropy moved away from what was called reputation-based funding,
Mhm.
meaning that, you know, charities and foundations and philanthropists stopped giving money to places just because they thought they were doing good work, and they wanted to really see what kinds of measurable outcomes people were having. So the kinds of measures that I'm interested in and that we conducted in the museum are, you know, how do people change in terms of shifts in attitude, knowledge, skills, or behaviors? And that might seem like a really unusual or lofty goal for an art museum to have. But I really believe that when people do have transformative experiences with art or in museums, they experience all of those things, and those things happen to be pretty measurable
Mhm.
things. So anyway, it's an exciting field, and I'm really excited to be at an academic museum now
Yeah.
too, where I'm surrounded by a lot of people that are interested in that type of research.
I agree with you
Mhm.
wholeheartedly that it's a hard thing to, I think if you had to sit down and write a paper about the ways in which your life has been altered by experiences that you've had, I'll
Yeah.
say me in museums, it would definitely have a correlation, I think, to discovery, to collaboration, to that kind of thing. I,
Mhm.
I I keep going back to it, but I am very interested. How did you measure it, or did you measure it? Do you ask people, how has your life been altered? Because
Yeah.
I go back to the trip made a couple of months ago, up to the Met, just because I felt like that's the thing I need to do right now. That is the thing that will link me back to humanity, to art for all time, to other people will, and there were fewer people, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, it was like everything.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, how did you measure it, or how do you measure it?
Yeah. I know
Both
that.
at the Met and now,
It is tough. I mean, learning and that kind of experience that people have is a very latent type of trait. Like even though the fMRI studies where we can actually see brain activity, if they're, you know, increasing by leaps and bounds, like we can't always like see how people are impacted. So we have to really rely on their behaviors or
Mhm.
what they're telling us. So in different ways, in my school and for my dissertation, I ended up using a lot of tools in the area of psychological research that sounds a little nefarious, but there are certain types of kind of subterfuge that you can use in psychological studies, you know, as long as they're approved by
Mhm.
by an institutional review board. I don't want people to think I started giving people electric shocks or
Yeah.
something like that. But the task that I often had people do was not to actually talk about their own experiences, because you can get all kinds of bias around that, but to actually set up some scenarios with surrogates. So I had people look at studies where there were two characters, Robin and Chris, who were having an argument about two different works of art. And one was a really abstract painting, and the other was a more kind of traditional landscape painting that was very illusionistic. And I had subjects kind of talk about whether Robin or Chris were right in their arguments and the reasons for why they were right. And so kind of getting into how are people starting to form judgments about works of art? What kind of criteria are they pointing to? Are people completely subjective and saying, well, art is in the eye of the beholder, it doesn't
Mhm.
matter? And so actually there's a whole area of psychological research that's called epistemological development, that people have done a lot of interesting work in. And so I really kind of built on that field of study to apply it to aesthetic evaluations, aesthetic judgments.
It's so funny as you were speaking, I had this idea of it's the theater part, I guess, of being, say, at the Guggenheim, at the Met or whatever, and watching the intent way in which people observe
Mhm.
art and what happens to their body, what happens to their face.
Okay.
That's part of what's really fun for me,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
to particularly in this space that I'm sitting in front of today, when you walk up and down the spiral, and just to see what's going through people's bodies and how they're expressing that is just like I thought, you stood behind them, and just tried to word bubble it or,
Right. Well, some researchers work that way. They, do kind of a rolling interview where people called a say aloud protocol, where people do try to give voice to what they're thinking right in that moment. I have a wonderful, wonderful friend and museum colleague, actually, who's also out of Philadelphia, went to UPenn, and she wrote a fantastic book called The Social Work of Museums. And for her dissertation, she followed people around in museums.
Oh,
She looked at dyads or couples of people to see what do they talk about when they go to a museum. And she found that actually most people spend most of their time talking about themselves in museums, which I think is really fascinating if we think about museums being more as mirrors
mirrors,
than they are
right.
as, warehouses of past.
So that's fascinating. Is it
Yeah.
sort of like this place? Yeah, I wondered about that. Would the conversations that you would be hearing be more about what's for dinner, where is Tom going to go to school, or
Hmm.
where is he not going, or and would a disproportionate of that conversation, amount of that conversation, be not about the art at all, but the art
Right.
as a frame
Yeah,
for what is
exactly.
happening, a safe place.
Mhm.
Something that you mentioned, that I read that you had written, was just to sort of, make museums more welcoming, that they can be, off-putting, or they can be, and I wonder, because, and I shouldn't keep coming back to myself, but I do, because that's is that it, how do we know that they aren't welcoming in that way, or
Yeah.
do we really know that?
Well, it's interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I worked down the street from where you are there at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for almost 20 years. I really worked there for much of my career. And I'd say, gosh, how long ago was this now? About 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the Met did a really extensive audience engagement survey, really large scale, asking people questions as they exited the museum about their visit. And this was for a whole host of reasons. It was about kind of shaping a strategic plan for the museum. It also was part of the rebrand that the Metropolitan went through a few years ago. But one of the questions that really caused all of us to jump out of our seats when we read the responses were that 40% of the visitors said that while they had a good experience at the museum, they didn't think that the museum was for someone like them. And that was a really horrifying statistic, that 40% of people would say that this is a nice place, but it's not for someone like me, is really unsettling to think about, especially when you're overseeing education. And
Sure,
kind of your
yeah.
whole raison d'etre is to get people engaged and to have them be thinking about, why do museums matter, and why should art matter in that case? So it really rattled us, and so we really spent the next few years digging into that to see, well, what does that mean? Is it because of their facilitated experiences? Is it because of the silent pedagogies or the unspoken messages that museums give out? Whether it's
Hmm.
going up an extensive set of marble steps at the front,
Hmm.
or maybe the
Hmm.
look that someone gives you at the information desk, or the fact that there's very few places to sit down, or things like that. Those are all messages that we receive about whether or not we're
Mhm.
welcome somewhere.
So, do you feel that it was when they said, "This is not a place for me,"
Mhm.
that was interpreted, or you felt the interpretation of that is, "I wasn't welcome here," or does it reflect more back on the psychology of the person
Mm.
giving the response, saying like, "I don't know how to interpret this," or "I don't know what to make of this," or "I'm confused," or "I'm," and either way, it's, as an educator, I guess it's your job to figure, to make it right,
Uh,
whatever that is. But I do, as you're talking, I do think oftentimes of people with absurdist material coming to the shows and saying, "I just didn't think this work was for me," or "I've never enjoyed this work before until I saw you all, somehow interpreting it," or "I felt comfortable because it was an emotional journey I could take and feel like I had a universal experience,
yeah,
you
no,
know?
all of those things, all the questions that you're asking are ones that we wondered about. And we never found exactly what the precise reasons were, but I think people gave that response of, they thought, well, this isn't a place for me, probably on many levels. It might have been through the kind of experience they had, but it also can be, museums are not always reflective of the people that they hope to serve.
Hmm. Yeah.
Increasingly, museums are trying to be more reflective of the world that we live in. They haven't always done a very good job of that, based
Hmm.
on their complicated histories and elitist histories. So it could be that people self-identify, they see themselves, like Lois Silverman would say, maybe they're talking about themselves and their own experiences, and there's some disconnect with
Hmm.
what they're seeing on the walls or in the sculptures in a museum.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think that's why it's really critically important for us to all create bridges, whether that means changing museums from the inside out, or, being able to help people, or to create a climate where transformative experiences can happen and where people can feel like, yes, these are places for me.
Hmm. Yeah, because you do wonder, do people come wanting a solitary experience? And then what happens, do they come in groups and want to be, want to move around and have a group experience that way? Is there anything about taking it, I mean, and I want to get to your work at Lehigh too, because and talking about how that's getting into the community and the ideas that you have for um, moving forward
Sure.
at the galleries at Lehigh. But is taking the work out into the community, when you have an institution and people are coming in, is it successful if you try to move it out like you did at Lehigh? And I guess, why don't we talk
Yeah.
about the project you're working on there? That's a.
Sure. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if there's a lesson that we all learn over and over again, is that you have to meet people where they are, whether that's physically, like going out to them, or digitally, like, finding out what are people interested in, where are they going, what platform are they using. And, I think, unfortunately, I think museums, like a lot of places, for many years subscribed to a build it and they will come philosophy. And of course, that doesn't always work. And so, I think going out into the community, not so much to feel like one is parachuting in to kind of save the community, but frankly, just to kind of be a good neighbor.
Mhm.
Like, we
Sure.
we all spend a lot of time where we work and where we live. And I think increasingly museums and arts organizations are just trying to be more participatory members of a community and a neighborhood, and to say, we're here too. We want to interact with the people who are around us, and who, we want to learn from all of you. And so that kind of reciprocal relationship, I hope, is one that museums are really moving toward.
Hmm. What was the, oh gosh, let's see. I have a question for you here.
Sure, yeah. Mhm.
Uh, Still in the area of how you actually measure people's
Mm.
response to art, what kinds of results seem to work when you apply for grants or funding or whatnot?
Yeah.
I hope I've got your question right.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of things, this probably won't surprise anyone here, but you get greater results the deeper or the more frequent your intervention. So it's hard to really create substantive change with kind of short events or one-off events or a single experience. So at least the studies that I'm familiar with and the ones that I conducted, certainly the more contact that you can have with your intended audience and the more types of transformative experiences that you can offer in a consistent way, you're more likely to have an impact. Um, Another aspect that people also do a lot of measuring around is that there are forces in the world that have a big impact on people that have nothing to do with museums or arts experiences, and that has to do with educational background, socioeconomic status, and of course there's a ton of things packed into socioeconomic status. Um, but I think it's encouraging to see that museums are trying to break down some of those barriers. They're recognizing them.
Mhm.
And so, because often what the kinds of transformations that we aim to see, they're ones that everyone should experience, and not just people who are already in the habit of going
Yeah.
to a museum.
So part of the education involves just the introduction of maybe different ways of thinking about the
Mhm.
way in which art can impact and sort of changing our ideas
Yeah.
about that. Is that, I mean,
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
was the pot of gold for you in your thinking, in what you were desiring when this opportunity came up for you at Lehigh,
Yeah.
to leave New York and all of your schooling and
Yeah, gosh, the pot of gold. That's a good way to think about it. Well, I mean, I had been at the Metropolitan for almost 20 years. I think I had, at the time, I had turned 45, I think, or 46. And I thought, I've been in this institution, and of course, as much as anyone can spend multiple lifetimes in a
sure.
place like the Guggenheim or the Metropolitan, or one really can. I thought, I'm in the highest position I'm going to have in the institution. I've got another 25 years of work ahead of me at least. I really want to try something new, and if not now, when? And I had been teaching already as an adjunct down at NYU in their master's program and in some other programs in the past. And I thought, I really like being in an academic environment. I like being surrounded by students that are asking great questions and are doing research. I also wanted to try to spread my wings and try being a director.
Mhm.
And so when this position at Lehigh came about, that combined being a director of the art galleries, but also with a faculty appointment in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design, I just couldn't pass it up. It just, was too perfect a position for
Mhm.
me at this time. And it's also a really exciting place. If any of your viewers are familiar with Bethlehem and the Lehigh Valley, it's fascinating. The now dormant
Mhm.
blast furnaces of Bethlehem Steel, they rise in the middle of town like a medieval cathedral, and it's a place that has making and creating and doing in the DNA of that area.
Mhm.
And so, what better place than to come in as a director of an art museum and get to do some really fun, exciting things. So I've really been enjoying it.
That's a really interesting, I think, way of thinking about it, having grown up in the Midwest too. And there was just a lot of art happening in these small towns in Indiana, because
Sure.
that's what you do. You make things and create things and grow things, and
Mhm.
it's in the DNA, that a lot of great bands coming out of,
It's
places. And,
true.
but I
Absolutely.
do think that's something in all of that. So being the director of a art gallery, you're curating, you're deciding what exhibitions are going to happen. You're curating. I'm interested in knowing what your day looks like being
Hmm.
being
Sure.
a director of an art gallery.
Sure. I mean, every day is different. I oversee the strategic direction of the art galleries. I work on what the exhibition schedule is going to be. Of course, I do things that maybe are not quite as exciting around budget management and things like that. But, what I find really exciting is that works of art, they can be remarkably silent unless they are activated in some way. You know,
Mhm,
Part of that activation is bringing them out of storage.
mhm,
So we try to do that as much as we can, or digitize them, or both. But I'm really interested in creating a climate where people can have these cathartic experiences and transformative experiences. When I started at Lehigh, we also recommitted ourselves to mounting exhibitions and doing programs that were about timely and relevant issues, things that people were talking about and concerned about and interested in. So the first real show that I did last year, fall of 2019, was a show by two artists, Margaret and Christine Wertheim, who are from Australia. And the show is called Crochet Coral Reef. And they're identical twin sisters. Margaret is a mathematician by training, and her sister Christine is a visual artist. She teaches at Cal Arts in Southern California now. And they work together to collaboratively crochet coral reefs in these really intricate, large scale, rambling constructions that fill the gallery. And then they invite communities to create their own crochet coral reefs. And so it
mm,
speaks to not only the issue of climate change, but it also speaks to the nature of what is art. And it's very performative in nature, and it's very much about community. And there's also a lot of interesting intersections around gender and around craft versus art. And so it was a really transformative experience for me. I hope for many people. We're really proud that over the past 2 years, we've increased our attendance by 86% at the art galleries. So that's been really exciting to see. And then with this exhibition that I'm happy to talk about on today of all days, and that exhibition is called Doing Democracy, and it's on view right now at the art galleries at Lehigh. And it's an exhibition that features photographs from our permanent collection that shows what it means to do democracy in all different ways, whether it's civil rights protests or global leaders or everyday Americans engaged in different activities. And so that's a show that, of course, we're particularly excited about right now.
Congratulations
Oh, thanks a lot. Well,
on that.
I,
How did you work to get this increase in attendance that's great
sure.
news. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's multiple factors. I should say I have a fantastic team. We are small but very ambitious, dedicated team of 7 people. And so Mark Wansidler, our curator of exhibitions and collections, Stacy Brennan, our curator of education, but all of my staff members, they work very collaboratively and in a very thoughtful way to think about, how do we really maximize the public value of what we're doing? So we have increased our public programming. We've also met people where they are by going to them. We've started advisory groups, including a student advisory group that has about 30 members at this point, which is great. They tell it like it is and tell us what they're interested in. And also, of course, great partners in the community, from Bethlehem Area School District to last fall, we became great friends with a knitting and crochet store that facilitated our workshops with Crochet Coral Reef. So I think, like all aspects of work, it's really about building relationships.
So do you have so you have student advisors that will sort of weigh in on what they want to see also in the gallery, and there are people going out into the community as well to just make sure that people are aware of what's happening and know that it's accessible to them, and
Um,
sort of like knocking on doors, if you will,
mm,
getting out the vote. Is that kind of a way of
yeah,
looking at it?
absolutely.
To
I mean,
let
I believe, and our team really believes that museums, like democracies, they work best when people participate. And in fact, they get better the more people use them. And so, our team regularly goes outside the walls to meet with people, to join committees around town, to, also participate in other people's creative work. We do a lot of listening. And then with this exhibition called Doing Democracy, we had the unique opportunity to actually put part of the exhibition outside. So we have the main exhibition, which is on view in our main gallery located in Zollner Art Center. But we also have 22 reproductions of photographs on these billboards, these placards that go along the South Bethlehem Greenway, which is kind of former rail to trail, popular jogging and skateboarding path. And so you can see these works of art on the Greenway, and then you can also point your smartphone at their QR codes and listen to an audio guide created by Lehigh students about the photographs. And I think that's particularly exciting because, these are emerging adults, many of them voters now, and they are future leaders no matter what field they go in. And I think it's really exciting and critical for us to know, why should they care about looking at these photographs from the 1950s and 60s? Like, getting them engaged with that material and understanding them both as great works of art, but also as historical moments, I think is really important, particularly now that we're living in historic moments right now of change.
Mhm.
Museums help us put that into a context.
The study, and there have been many, but I'm thinking the one that from the University of Pennsylvania, talking about the wellness and how it's been demonstrated, obviously, that art is really important for wellness in a community. It seems to me like pulling the art out in the way that you just described it, like just plopping it, not plopping it, but that was not a good word, but putting it down and saying, like, here it is, and then really making it approachable and accessible. And then in the ways that you talked about initially, that you may not exactly know the way in which it's changing your life, but at the end of the day, you just might in your mind cognitively feel as though you're a little bit smarter than you were at the beginning of that day, or a little bit more connected to the process and a little bit more empowered in that process. I love the idea of it being out in the community.
Uh, Absolutely, and I mean, I have to say, I didn't invent this idea. In fact, some of it is really inspired by an incredibly well-received program that the Detroit Institute of Arts did several years ago called Inside Out, where they reproduced key works from their collections and put them all over Detroit. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has done it recently. But you're absolutely right. Like, sometimes the more contact that we have with art, even if it's kind of peripheral in some way, like maybe we're just skateboarding by it or jogging by it,
Yeah.
it's powerful and it can change the way that we think about art. I think it also shines a spotlight on some fundamental questions about, where does art happen? Like, where does the experience of art really happen? Like,
Mhm.
does it always happen in our galleries in a museum? I know for me personally, like, some of the most powerful experiences I've had with art or with a performance or with the film was not even right in that moment. It might have
Mhm.
been days or weeks or months later where I was thinking back on it and I thought, wow, like, wait a minute.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what that artist was trying to say, or this reminds me of this scene from this performance. And I
Mhm.
think honestly, the more art that we get into our lives, I think there's the potential for us to see the world differently. Um, so I think it's a really exciting value proposition.
That's such a fascinating thing to idea to consider, the ways in which it hits you at that moment, and then what happens, coming out of the thrift drug in South Philadelphia, I don't know, a
Mhm.
month or so ago, and looked up, and there was a big mural arts, mural on the side of this old building that I had never noticed before, and it was in the middle of COVID, and it was just one of those days, and just thinking like how astonishing it was and how beautiful it was, and it really made an enormous difference in my day, and I thought, thankfully,
Uh,
to be so thankful for art in all its many ways here in Philadelphia and around the country. It's interesting to think about it in that way. How does it hit you in that moment? And then what does it do to your psyche for the rest of, your day, your week, your world? Oh gosh, let's see. Well, there's one question here I want to get to in a second, but I want to ask you, so, having spent a fair amount of time in New York, up on, up there, now you grew up in Virginia, so that was, that's a different environment, but do you think there's something to, and what is that something, to the energy that a city
hmm,
brings to the brain, to the ideas, to the foment of, not the foment, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean,
sure.
the bubbling of all of that versus, say, where you are now,
Mhm. Yeah,
in a more rural setting.
yeah.
Do you
It's
feel different?
interesting. It does. I mean, in some ways, it's familiar to me because, growing up, I grew up in such a rural area where you really had to kind of look to yourself to, ignite your own creativity. And sometimes working within those constraints actually kind of created more opportunities. Like,
Mhm,
you didn't have an art supply store to go to, and there was no internet then to order it from.
mhm,
So you had to kind of come up with your own creative materials there. I love cities, and I love New York, and in fact, where you are right now on 88th Street there at the
mhm.
Guggenheim, we keep an apartment on 88th Street just down the block from the Guggenheim, so we're back and forth in New York a lot. But honestly, our other home is in Bucks County, just south of where Lehigh is, and we're in a very rural area. We're fortunate to
Mhm.
be next to a state park, lots of wildlife, often trying to come inside of our house. But
They love art too.
oh
So.
yeah, everyone's welcome, I guess. But for me anyway, I feel like I appreciate the city and the country more when I can kind of toggle back and forth between both.
Yeah.
I think like a lot of people, I have a love-hate relationship with Manhattan because
Mhm.
I love everything that it offers. But honestly, one of the reasons too why I shifted gears is, working 20 years at the Metropolitan, I really worked 24/7.
Yeah.
Like I really did not stop working. And that was the
Mhm.
expectation.
Yeah, sure.
Everyone there worked all of the time. And so even though I loved being in New York, it actually was really pretty rare that I got out to walk up the street to the Guggenheim where you are, or
Mhm.
to go see a show or things like that. And so, I think, getting some perspective and getting some distance can be really helpful, at least for me, to balance out all of that kind of creative energy.
Mhm. Do you have a studio now?
I do somewhat. I have kind of a studio space in my garage. I have a studio in my basement. I sort of have a studio in our dining room, which annoys my husband to no end because I have piles of things everywhere. But it's, space is an issue. Even when I was in Manhattan, like when I was in the World Trade Center, I was fortunate to have a really huge studio on the 91st floor. But then after that, I had a tiny, tiny space in the basement on East Fifth Street in Bowery. And it's kind of amazing how that affects your work.
Yeah, yes. Constraint
Oh, yeah,
is everything,
absolutely.
or a lot of it. What's your, the medium you enjoy most?
Hmm.
Do you have a favorite or?
Yeah, I mean, I move across different media, but I always tend to come back to more two-dimensional work. So I work quite a bit in drawing and painting,
Mhm,
are really, I think, where I self-identify.
mhm. I just ran across the book Drawing on the, is it right side of the brain?
Oh, sure,
Is it
Betty
right?
Ford.
Right. I just pulled
Mhm.
it out. It's like 30 years old or however old it is. I pulled it out. I was like,
Yeah.
I really need to go back to this again and really sort of
Yeah.
just take the time to really see things and see things in the way
Well,
they are, as opposed to
not to kind of squeeze in a little bit of marketing here, but I'll do that. Speaking of drawing, and actually a lot of the concepts that Betty Edwards talks about in that book, which are kind of philosophical in nature,
Mhm.
we're going to be doing an exhibition at Lehigh next fall of 21, called Thinking Through Drawing. And it's all about how people use drawing as a tool for thinking in different ways. So not only solving aesthetic problems like preparatory sketches or making drawings out in the world, but also how do people use drawing as a way to make the invisible visible or to problem solve. So
Mm.
we're really excited about that. So I hope you'll come up and
Oh, I would love to be yeah, definitely want to. I was like, I'll be in that class.
yeah, please. That'd be great. Our,
I
our
would,
our goal is to get everyone in the whole region drawing. So
oh.
we're gonna see if we can meet that goal.
Do you think that there's still a distance from what you can see in the idea that creativity is not for everybody?
Hmm,
That people like are, grow up thinking that you're either creative or you aren't,
right.
but maybe not under, not being exposed to the ideas that there's just creative acts in everything we do, and then just, I mean, do you?
Yeah.
It sort of feels like this is, I'm not, I'm only
Hmm.
seeing it from a different perspective, but that there's this idea that there's creative people and that there's not, and
Yeah. It's complicated. I mean, that's a whole field of research in and of itself. I think, different views about creativity, like a lot of people who are human developmental psychologists would say, everyone starts out very creative. There's usually a turn that happens,
Mhm,
like often around third or fourth grade, where people are much more reluctant to express themselves. This also has to do with peer acceptance. It has to do with the formal education system that we're living in here in the United States. Um, but other people too, like I would say some of it has to do with mindset. Really popular researcher who focuses on this work is Carol Dweck out of Stanford. And she really studies, um, whether it's creativity or whether it's other areas, how does our mindset, like what we tell ourselves about what we're good at, how does it
mhm,
affect whether or not we're really good at something? And similarly, whether or not we praise people or how we praise people or not, based on how they're doing or what they're doing, can really affect how well they do. So I'm a believer in, things are not so fixed. Things are
mhm,
pretty malleable. The human brain is pretty malleable. But I think it's a matter of, how do we um, get the kinds of experiences that we need to bring that out. And
mhm.
so I think that's probably why, like you, like why I've found myself in the arts as, a way to do that.
Well, and it seems like f- the passion that you really have is very clear to help people understand the ways in which they can find their ways into these transformative experiences. Because I do think when you have a brush and a love with art, it's like running or anything else. Like uh, it's a thing that you may not be able to describe, but it is in there for you and affecting in affecting your life.
Yeah.
What do you see as uh, what's on the horizon in terms of the the things that you want to accomplish
Mm.
at Lehigh in the next year or so,
Ooh,
aside from
that's
this exciting exhibit
uh,
that we all want to see?
I mean, a number of things. Like we, are really excited to be mounting exhibitions and offering programs that, really, help people have transformative experiences with art, whatever that means for them. Last year, we also spent a lot of time rewriting our mission statement. And so our mission statement is now that we advance critical thinking, cultural understanding, and well-being for campus and community. So, as we were talking about earlier, this idea of art being a vehicle for increased well-being for individuals and communities is something that we're really excited about. Lehigh has launched a new College of Health, and so we're in close conversation with them about, how can the art galleries play a role in that.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all things that we're really excited about. Something that we're in very, very early days of talking about and is not formally approved, I should say, as a disclaimer here, but we are in early conversations about what would it look like for Lehigh to build a new standalone art museum on campus that would be both a philosophical and functional bridge between the campus and the community. And so we're really excited about that. We're at almost 17,000 works of art at Lehigh from diverse time periods and cultures. And we just really want to maximize the possibilities that it has to offer.
So would it physically, proximity wise, be more like further towards the community? When you say bridge, is that part of
Yeah.
it? So they don't have to.
It's funny about almost about exactly 100 years ago, there was a great museum educator named John Cotton Dana who worked at the Newark Museum in New Jersey. And he talked about museums need to be where people are, as we've discussed. And he said, they really should be more like a great department store. Bamberger's had opened in Newark at that time. And he actually was saying all of this too, to kind of disparage other museums that had moved away from the population into beautiful parks, like the Metropolitan had done. It had moved from its 14th Street location up to Central Park. And so I'm a believer in really museums being conveners and catalysts and places that intermingle everyone in a community. So, so as beautiful as the Lehigh campus is, and actually as many acres as Lehigh has, I would envision that this museum would be straddling the campus and the local community on the south side of Bethlehem.
I know very little about this, but are there not in Japan lots of, and probably in other cities as well, and I just haven't had the fortune to be there, but I thought I remember hearing a lot about that being a thing where it's like an art gallery in the middle of Tokyo, and it's also a this and a
Yeah,
that and a whatever, and you can't miss it. I mean, in other
yeah.
words, you're going to go through it, whether you're on your way to get your whatever it is you're getting, and then you're sort of surrounded by it. So the experience is built in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a lot of places have experimented with that. A few years ago, I was in the Emirates in Dubai, and actually they were experimenting with some of that at the Mall of the Emirates, where they had, art exhibitions. And actually, a great friend of mine who's a wonderful museum director, Victoria Ramirez, she's building a new museum for the Arkansas Arts Center down in Little Rock. And they've temporarily moved into a shopping center. And, of course, the pandemic is not really helping things at the moment. But in principle, I think it's a really interesting idea to think about, where do we meet people where they are? How do we engage people in their day-to-day experiences and not be these kind of rarefied,
Mhm.
isolated places?
Destination where you kind of have to really sort of make
Make
your own journey, if you will.
Mhm. Exactly.
Um, if I were a high school student right now and I were wanting to, and I were going off to college and I were thinking about being a fine artist, is there any, it's a broad question, but is there anything that you learned from that time that has served you well? I'm
Yeah.
sure there are many things, but
I think this is such a maybe an obvious one that everyone says, but there's really no substitute for making your work and creating your work and prioritizing it. Making sure that you have time to create your work all of the time. Um, because, there are many things that will vie for your attention
Mhm.
over your life, whether it's, part of your job, or going to the grocery store, or doing the dishes. And I mean, I think that's really the single biggest piece of advice, because if you really are meant to be an artist, if that is your calling, you should listen to that calling, and you should make that time to keep making your work, and to struggle with it, and to show it to people when possible. And there's really no substitute for that.
Would you consider yourself pretty structured in your approach, both maybe then and more recently in your approach to art? Do you still make time to create art? Do you feel that that's something you need to be doing?
I do. Actually, maybe that's one silver lining of the pandemic. I have gotten back into my drawings and my paintings. So I think like a lot of people right now, I've been kind of returning to that creative practice as an outlet, and as a way to de-stress, and as a way to reconnect with what I am passionate about. So I'm hoping that that continues even in a post-COVID era.
Yeah, me too. I just looked up because I don't have a clock. So I looked on the computer and I was like, oh, it's 5:55. Oh no, he has to go to dinner.
Okay.
Well, I just have been so enjoyed finding out about all the great work you're doing, William. Thank you so
Thank
much for taking the time to come on Into the Absurd. And I really am excited about the work you're doing at Lehigh. I can't wait for next fall. And as we all work through this together, like you said, to try
you.
to do our work, do our art during this time.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, yeah, it was a great guy. I thought we had 20 more minutes, so I looked up. And, well, thank you so much, and I really look forward to seeing what's to come at Lehigh.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Stay well,
Yeah,
everyone. Take
yeah,
care.
you too. And thanks to you for being with us this evening. And we do wish you a very well week ahead. On next week's show, Lane Savadov will be with us. Lane is the artistic director and founder of Ego Po Classic Theater here in Philadelphia, and I'm going to talk to him about the work that they are planning. They have a season coming up, and I want to get it right here, so I'm going to say it's called Isolation's Radically Intimate Theater Events Experienced in Social Isolation. So we're going to talk to him about that season coming up, his work all throughout the years that has gone into the work that he now does at Ego Po, his studies with Lee Brewer at Mabu Mines and Ping Chong, and oh gosh, his work in Viewpoints, and Anne Bogart at City Company. So there's a lot on the table next week with Lane Savadov. We'll be here on Saturday at 5 p.m. If you're on the IRC's mailing list, look for an email from us this week. If not, head on over to the IRC's website and sign up for our mailing list, and keep up to date with what's happening. We're going to be here at 5 p.m. Saturdays from here into the near future, talking to the people who are passionate and doing really interesting things in our community, keeping us together, keeping us thinking and curious. With that in mind, wishing you a very safe and a very celebratory week ahead.